Hey everyone, welcome to Tales in Text and I'm your host Nisha and welcome to another Mahabharta book review. So yes, I know you won't believe it. I have finished the volume 4 of the critical edition of the Mahabharata. And for the very first time, I've actually completed the Mahabharata volume in under 2 months. That's insane, right? Just one day short of 2 months. So it's a personal record for me and I'm sure many of you will be happy that I've completed this volume so soon, because then you can get the review and all of us together can move on to volume 5. So without any further ado, I will start discussing about volume 4 of the critical edition of the Mahabharata. So we ended volume 3 after the 12 years of the exile had been completed. So there was just one more, the 13th year pending, and the Pandavas along with Draupadi had to spend that 13th year incognito. And so they do that by going to Virata's kingdom. Now, Virata is a very powerful king, and he's someone who stays close enough to Hastinapur for the Pandavas to keep track of what's going on and where Duryodhana is and what his plans are. But it's still separated both geographically and even in politically in terms of relationships. It's separated and distant enough from Hastinapura so that the Pandavas can, breathe a sigh of relief and know that, okay, we won't get caught and we won't get recognized. So they go into Virata's kingdom, where if you already aware of the story, you will know that they take up positions as servants within Virata's palace. So that's where we begin volume 4 of the BORI Critical Edition of the Mahabharata. So Yudhishthira becomes an advisor to Virata, specifically an advisor for gambling, because Virata loves to gamble, Yudhishthira loves to gamble. In fact, gambling is what led Yudhishthira into this mess of the 13-year exile in the first place. Yet he feels that, okay, I have enough knowledge of gambling, that is technical knowledge, and also the knowledge of the consequences of inconsiderate gambling, that I can give or add value to Virata in his desire to learn better gambling techniques, right? So Yudhishthira becomes an advisor for gambling, and he becomes one of the trusted, I wouldn't say ministers exactly, but a confidant of the king. Then Bhima becomes a cook in the royal kitchens. Nakula and Sahadeva take care of the horses and the cows in the stables of the king. And Arjuna becomes Brihannala or Brihannada, depending on which version of the epic that you're reading. Essentially, this is a trans person who is hired by Virata to teach dance to the princess Uttara. And finally, Draupadi becomes Sairandri, who is the servant who works with the queen to help take care of her hairdo, her makeup and things like that. Essentially mainly her hair, but essentially she works in the queen's entourage. So that's where we start the volume 4. And volume 4 is really interesting because a lot of times we see that Virata Parva is just spoken in terms of, okay, what do these people do in Virata's palace for the 1 year, and then we look at Kichaka's involvement, because Kichaka lusts after Draupadi, and then he's killed by Bhima, who pretends to be Draupadi, because they kind of lure him in and they kill him later on, right? And we know that there are certain interpretations of the epics, like for example, the Palace of Illusions by Chitra Banerjee Divakarani, where we find out that Draupadi says that she is, or as Sairandri, she says that my husbands are Gandharvas and they're the ones who killed Kichaka. So all those things are common knowledge for most of us who are familiar with the epics. But one of the main things that I found in the Virata Parva was how there is a section after Kichaka's death where Draupadi is, or rather the Kichaka's brothers force Draupadi to commit sati. It doesn't go through, of course, because she's saved by Bhima, but they basically tie her up and they drag her by the hair, and they tie her up and they take her to the funeral pyre of Kichaka and they try to force her to commit sati. And hearing her cries, Bhima comes and saves her, and because he's so enraged, nobody is able to recognize that, hey, this is the cook who's living in the kitchens with us, and they feel like he is one of the Gandharva husbands that Sairandri was actually talking about. So this was a very unique addition to the story that I actually found out. At least no interpretation that I had ever read contained this information about the forceful almost sati of Draupadi. So it was an interesting perspective to look at how this was included in the epic, and also a very real reminder of the horrors that was visited upon women whose not just husbands, whose patrons, the men who were patronizing them. If they died, what would be done to those women? So it was a reminder, a very sobering reminder of that fact. So we finish the Virata Parva essentially with the death of Kichaka, and then we have the next part of the Parva of the Mahabharata. And I'm just going to go through chapter by chapter like I did with the last book. So just quickly run you through what takes place in each of the chapters. So after Virata Parva and Kichaka Vada Parva, we have the Go-harana Parva, and this is the section of the book where Virata's cows are stolen by the Kauravas, or they try to steal these cows. And this is the time when, because the Pandavas have been essentially eating the salt of Virata and his generosity, right? So Yudhishthira and Arjuna and everyone decide, we can't let our host and our king suffer through the hands of the Kauravas, especially after we have, literally got our living off of him, after we've got our safety off of him. So we need to help him. And that is when, so essentially two things happen over here. The first section is where the Trigarthas, another group of kings, they come and attack Virata's kingdom as a sort of, you could call it like a sort of diversion. And that's where the four brothers go, except for Arjuna. The four brothers go and they basically defeat the Trigarthas and they come back. And during that time, Duryodhana and his group come and try to steal the cows. And that's where Arjuna single-handedly, he with the help of Uttara's brother Uttara, they're called by the same names. He single-handedly defeats the Kaura army and he saves the cows. And it is in this section, so in the introduction to the Mahabharata, you see Bibek Debroy mentioning that possibly the idea for the larger Kurukshetra war must have come from the Go-harana Parva. So this is something that he mentions in the introduction to the, not just the volume, to the entire series. And the reason he feels this way is because more than, the fight for the throne or fight for power or even fight for women, the oldest form of indication of power of kingship was the ownership of cows. So in ancient India, cows were the assets that people would judge in order to understand, okay, how rich a person is, how prosperous or how powerful a person is. So since this particular Go-harana Parva is actually a very extensive Parva, I mean comparatively to the other Parvas in this particular volume, it's pretty long, and if it had just been a minor fight, it wouldn't have necessitated such a long and drawn out description of this Parva. Almost all the major players in the Mahabharata who take a part in the Kurukshetra war, they are part of the Go-harana Parva during that fight. Of course, Krishna is not there, but again, once again, that really lends to me more credence to the fact that this could possibly have been a story of, of a fight between two factions, two clans in ancient times who fought over a bunch of cows, and that story inspired the Mahabharata. Because at the end of the day, we have to look at what was the real, very human story that inspired the larger divine narrative. So I do feel like, yes, that theory of Vivek Debroy does have some legitimacy, especially given the kind of in-depth description that's given of the battles, of the astras that are used, and the weapons and the strategies and so on. Now, after the Go-harana Parva, so because of the way Brihannala fights while trying to save the cattle, Duryodhana is able to identify that, okay, this is Arjuna, because no one apart from Arjuna fights like this, with this kind of ferocity, with this kind of finesse, and using these types of weapons. So this must definitely be Arjuna, which means the Pandavas are in Virata's kingdom. So he is under the assumption, that is, Duryodhana is under the assumption that he has defeated the Pandavas because they have been found, the exile is not over, and they need to go another 13 years into the forest. But unfortunately for him, astrologically speaking, the 13th year would have ended exactly on that very day, just before the cows would have been stolen by the Kauravas. So very technically speaking, the Pandavas would have adhered to the exile and the terms of the exile, and now they don't need to go back into exile anymore. So we end the Go-harana parva at a very, a sort of a, you could call it a cliffhanger, because now it's sort of like it's come into an impasse where Duryodhana is certain that Yudhishthira is lying, that he completed the 13 years in exile, and Yudhishthira is again sticking to his guns and saying, you know what, me and my brothers have completed the 13 years in exile. You have to give us what is owed to us. So please give it to us, right? So there is that sort of tussle between the two groups, and finally Bhishma and Drona, along with the other elders and the sages, they chart down astrologically what is the exact time period did 13 years get completed, and they finally vote in favor of the Pandavas. And while all of this is happening, we also cover the next parva, which is the Vaivahika parva, which is the marriage of Abhimanyu and Uttara. And then finally, after this, we dive right into the Udyoga parva. Now, up until the Udyoga parva, and again, I'm talking about volumes 2, 3, and 4 up until this point, we've operated under the assumption that if the Pandavas complete their terms of the exile, then the Kauravas will give them what is owed to them. There has always been this sort of hope that maybe we won't need to take things too far. You know, this is just a skirmish between two warrior faction brother communities, you could say, or groups of cousins, and things don't need to go super far. And up until this point, even the older members of the Kuru clan, that is Bhishma and Drona and Viduraa and Dhritarashtra, they don't seem to really believe that war could be a very real danger. So I'm excluding volume 1 from this, because volume 1, like I mentioned, I think in the volume 1, the review, if you watched it, is that for like 70% of that is just about the Hindu mythos, Hindu world, and last 30% is just the initial parts of the Kuru lineage. It is from volume 2 onwards that we actually meet the Pandavas and get immersed in their stories. And so volume 2, volume 3, and up till this part of volume 4, you still have that hope that things can be resolved if we just have conversations and the older generation people kind of intervene. In Udyoga Parva, all of this is this becomes questionable, because Udyoga Parva is where the preparations for war actually begin. The Kauravas and the Pandavas have kind of reached an impasse, like I mentioned, and there is no guarantee whether Duryodhana will say yes to giving half of the kingdom back, because up until now the expectation was that give us half of the kingdom back, you keep half, we'll take half. And then in Udyoga Parva, Yudhishthira finally, because Duryodhana just refuses to listen to any arguments or any advice, so Yudhishthira says, okay, don't give us half the kingdom, give us 5 villages, 1 for each brother, and that's enough for us, and you keep the rest of the kingdom. And Duryodhana is really angry, and he says, I will not hand over even a piece of land that can come on the tip of a sharp needle. Even that much piece of land I will not hand over to the Pandavas, so I'm not going to budge. So Udyoga Parva sort of starts from that perspective where there's a huge pushback from the Kauravas, and the very real threat of the war actually coming into fruition, the war taking place, starts. Then after the Udyoga Parva, we have the Sanjayana Parva, where Sanjaya basically that is Dhritarashtra sent Sanjaya to speak to the Pandavas to find out, okay, my son is refusing to see sense, but perhaps you could give us some sort of a compromise, right? And he asks the Pandavas for some to meet him halfway, and this is where exactly the whole can you give us the 5 villages conversation actually happens, along with a couple of other things. And Yudhishthira and the other brothers actually explain to Sanjaya, look, we have adhered to our end of the deal, our end of the bargain, so can you please ask Duryodhana to do the same. One of the main things that I really liked in Sanjayana Parva was that Yudhishthira actually calls out Dhritarashtra for his lack of providing direction to his sons. So till now, up until in volume 2 also, when the gambling match happens, and twice, not just once, if you remember, and the Pandavas and Draupadi are forced to go into exile. Even then the Pandavas did not question Dhritarashtra for not stopping Duryodhana and Shakuni from intervening, because at the end of the day, you have to remember that Dhritarashtra is still the king. Even if Duryodhana is the one who calls the shots, behind the scenes, Dhritarashtra is still the king for all intents and purposes. So if he wanted to, he could have stopped both the gambling match, he could have stopped the exile, and he could have prevented Duryodhana from, by forcibly making him stop. But Dhritarashtra is not doing any of those. He is just getting carried away with the threats and the cries and the temper tantrums of his son. So Yudhishthira, in this Sanjayana Parva, Yudhishthira actually calls out Dhritarashtra for not providing that fatherly direction and guidance to Duryodhana, and also for not providing that fatherly support and protection to the Pandavas, because after Pandu's death, Dhritarashtra by default becomes father or father figure to the Pandavas. And so he actually calls Dhritarashtra out, and he says that, look, because we respected you, we went on to complete the exile. We didn't fight with your sons immediately after the gambling match, and we're only asking you for our share, not even complete share, but just 5 villages now, and out of respect for you, we have agreed to compromise. So why are you not doing your part? So I really enjoyed that part, that aspect of it, because in Indian culture especially, we have this filial piety wherein the younger people are supposed to respect the older generation and accept what the older generation says without questioning. This is especially true in the ancient epics, where the word of the older generation, the word of the elders, is like law. So to see a younger person, to see someone who has been a dependent on the king actually question the king, turn around and say, you are not doing what you are supposed to do. You're not discharging your duties as an uncle or as a king by behaving in this way. So it was really interesting to see that. And so after this this particular okay, one more thing I do remember that I do want to actually kind of talk to you about is Sanjaya himself. So Sanjaya, as the charioteer and as the advisor of Dhritarashtra, I mean, he is badass. Okay, if there is one character that I absolutely came to love in this particular volume, was Sanjaya, because Sanjaya gives zero shits about the fact that Dhritarashtra is king. When he comes back from visiting the Pandavas, and Dhritarashtra is like really nervous, he wants to know what Sanjaya has heard from the Pandavas. He wants to hear from him, so he calls him at night. So Sanjaya, okay, he's really tired already from the long journey that he's had to make from Virata's kingdom which is in Matsya, and back to Hastinapura. So he's tired and he's angry with what Duryodhana is doing. So he literally, he rips into Dhritarashtra, he scolds him, and and Sanjay also calls him out for his double standards and for his lack of having a spine, right? He doesn't have a spine, Dhritarashtra doesn't have a spine, and for his moral blindness. The reason I point this out is because, when we look at Dhritarashtra as a blind king, it is very easy to forget that this blindness isn't just physical. It's actually symbolic. It's a metaphor for his emotional and moral blindness towards the faults of his sons. It is his blindness towards actually understanding, okay, what roles should I discharge and which roles should take precedence over being that of a father, because there's a huge difference between being a father and being a king. So that blindness is actually a metaphorical representation of his unwillingness to recognize the faults of the people who are going wrong. So Sanjaya really calls him out on that, and oh my god, I love Sanjaya because it takes a lot of guts to tell a leadership figure what you really think about them. So kudos to Sanjaya. Okay, so after this parva is done, we have the Prajagara parva, where basically Dhritarashtra calls Viduraa, because Viduraa is Viduraa is his half brother. Viduraa is also someone who's really wise, so he wants to just have a conversation with Viduraa and just just feel reassured that okay, things are going to get better. He wants to hear Vidura say that okay, things are going to go well. It is in this parva that I really want to actually discuss a little bit about Vidura as a person and as a character. So Vidura, as you know, is not completely Kshatriya. He's half his lineage is mixed. Like his if you consider the Varna system, his lineage is mixed, and his I believe his mother was from the servant class, and of course Vyasa, as you know, was his father. So he comes from a mixed lineage, class-wise and caste-wise. And I've actually felt this right from volume 2 onwards, where we were introduced to Vidura, and especially in volume 4, in the Prajagara Parva, where he has a lot of conversation with Dhritarashtra. I have felt that Vidura has such a deep sense of empathy for the Pandavas and for Kunti and for everything that they've been through. And he's able to really understand the nuances and nitty-gritties of their experience that a lot of other people in the epic just cannot. And that really makes me wonder whether his class, caste, and his overall position in the Kuru clan, especially since he is not completely Kshatriya, right? He is half, if you look at the Varna system, half Shudra, right? Is it because his mother comes from one of the most marginalized and oppressed castes in the Varna system that he has this extremely deep sense of empathy and kindness and visibility into the struggles of the common man, and therefore he's able to understand the struggles that the Pandavas go through when they are functioning as common men while during the course of the exile and during their stay in Virata's kingdom. So I got that sense of how, because of his birth and because of his role and his place in the Kuru clan, Vidura is definitely one of the wisest and one of the most empathetic characters in the entire Kuru dynasty. So it was really nice to actually get acquainted with him and with his views of dharma. And it's very interesting because in this particular parva, Vidura says some such poignant poignant perspectives and poignant thoughts about dharma and about the role of kings and just about everything that's going on. There's some really poignant philosophizing happens in this particular parva. And yet at the end of it, he says that, oh, I'm partly Shudra, so I still don't know everything about dharma. So I kind of feel like, the writers, because we have to remember that these epics were ultimately written by the ruling caste, which is Brahmins. And so there is a lot of, if you read the entirety, even up to volume 4, you'll see that there is a lot of information here wherein Brahmanical hegemony is established, where Brahmin supremacy is foisted upon the characters and upon us as readers. So despite Vidura showing such incredible wisdom, so much knowledge and such strong knowledge of dharma, even he is made to say that because I'm half Shudra, I don't know everything about dharma. So which I feel like is very flawed, right? Because when you read this, you'll actually understand what I'm saying. Personally, I did not appreciate that statement. Now, after Prajagara Parva, we have the Sanatsujatiya Parva, which is, for me, in the 4 volumes that I have read, this is my most favorite parva ever. And that's because this has one of the most touching, poignant, and powerful philosophy and discussions on dharma in the epic. I absolutely loved this. So for those of you who might be wondering who Sanatsujatiya is, I did some research. So because there is not a grown sage, I would say, whose name is Sanatsujatiya, but I did find out that Sanatsujatiya is considered to be one of the Sanata Kumaras, that is the mind-born children or child sages of Brahma. So these Kumaras, as you know, they are around 5 years old and they're child sages and they don't ever age and they have all of the infinite wisdom of the universe, and their job is just to go and to teach people who want to learn about the mysteries of the universe and just understand about Dharma at a deeper level. So Sanatsujatiya is considered to be one of the Sanata Kumaras. According to my research, although traditionally there are four Sanatas who are considered to be the primary child, mind-born children of Brahma, in certain Puranas, apparently there are 8 Sanatas. So Sanatsujatiya is considered one of them. So in this particular parva, we have the discussion between Sanatsujatiya and Dhritarashtra about everything that's happening and about morality as a whole. Now, one thing that I really felt was a lot of the philosophizing and discussions that take place in the Sanatsujatiya parva are devoid of the casteism, sexism, transphobia, classism, Brahminical hegemony. A lot of those are just eradicated. And the reason I say this is because there's a lot of things that are told that can apply universally, and there's a lot of wisdom that sort of transcends these man-made hierarchies and man-made sense of superiority, inferiority, and so on. And I wonder, is it because Sanatsujatiya is supposed to be a child, right? The Sanatas are supposed to be children, and children are, they come into this world without that lens of prejudice and stereotype, and because of that they don't judge, and the wisdom that comes through them is so pure, and it's devoid of the taints that we as adults have, because we are so prejudiced through our experiences in life and through what we've been told. So I kind of felt like perhaps because Sanatsujatiya is supposed to be one of the Sanatas, and because they're supposed to be children, that innocence and that purity of thought, which is devoid of prejudice and stereotyping and judgment, is what gives this clarity of direction and this poignancy in the wisdom that is imparted in this particular parva. And that's why this is this is my most favorite parva so far. So I'll let you know if in the future volumes I have a parva that I enjoy more than this one. But if there's one parva that I want everyone to read, it has to be Sanatsujatiya parva. In the very first video of my introduction to the Mahabharta readathon, I have provided free links to the PDFs of these books. So if you can get hold of those, the free PDFs, do check it out. It's in volume 4. Alright, so after he has a conversation with Sanatsujatiya, we have the Yanasandhi Parva, where it's morning now, because Sanjaya, like I mentioned, he comes at night after his travels, and all these conversations happen at the night. In the next morning, Sanjaya informs the entire Kaurava court with Duryodhana and Karna and Shakuni, Dushasana and everyone else present exactly what the Pandavas said, what their expectations are, and he even offers some advice to Duryodhana. And in this particular Yanasandhi Parva, we see Bhishma and Drona and Dhritarashtra trying to convince Duryodhana to adhere to the terms of the exile and not just give them 5 villages, but to give them half of the kingdom back. But then ultimately, things don't work out, and Duryodhana says no, which leads us to the next parva, which is the largest parva in volume 4, which is the Bhagavat-yana parva. Now, Bhagavat-yana parva is basically, Bhagavat is in reference to Krishna, because that's a name that is used to refer to Krishna. And it is in this parva that Krishna actually goes to the Kaurava court to speak to Duryodhana and to just try to convince him that, okay, can you please give them what you had promised, and stop behaving like you're behaving. And I just want to talk a little bit more deeply about this parva, so I'm just going to open that up right here. It is in the Bhagavat-yana parva that we actually come across so many in-depth stories about ancient Hindu beliefs and ancient Hindu myths. And this parva is extremely interesting because of the stories that you're told about the old gods, about the old world order, about so you find out about Swarga, you find out about Patala, you find out about the Nagas, and how and based on my research I found out how Naga is just a catch-all term for 3 types of serpents, Nagas, Pannagas, and Urugas. and we find out stories of the king Dambodhava. We find out the story about how Matali, that is Indra's charioteer, searched for a groom for his daughter. And then we find out about sage Galava and his obstinacy in trying to fulfill a vow that he gave to Vishwamitra. And then we find out a story about Yayati, and finally one more story that I'm going to come to at the end. Before I do that, I just want to talk a bit about um, the Galava story in particular. So Galava basically was learning from Vishwamitra, and he asked Vishwamitra that I want to give you something as Guru Dakshina. And despite Vishwamitra saying, you know what, I don't want anything from you, Galava is obstinate. He keeps pestering his preceptor until Vishwamitra says, okay, I want 800 horses who are completely white, but just one ear is black. And so Galava tries to go around the world to find these horses. He can't get them. And he goes to Yayati, and Yayati says, you know what, I have a daughter called Madhavi who is destined to start 4 separate lineages. So can you, you know what, why don't you use her and barter her in order to get the horses? So Galava basically takes control of Madhavi and takes her to 4 different people, 3 of them who are kings and one is who is Vishwamitra himself, in order to sort of have them beget children on her. This particular story was just really heartbreaking and just very very morally, like, you know, I wouldn't say ambiguous, because it's certainly not ambiguous. If you think about the dharmas of different people and what is considered morally right and what is morally wrong, you have to ask yourself, okay, is it morally right and more morally important for a person to give his guru the Guru Dakshina that he promised, or is it more important for a person to respect the sanctity of a woman's body, to respect her feelings, to respect her agency? Because what Galava does is basically he pimps out Madhavi, right? So he basically forces her to sleep with 4 different people so that she can become a baby making machine for them, and they get their sons. And then they give Galava in payment, instead of in cash, they give him a bunch of horses that fits the description, and they send Madhavi on her way. So this particular story of Galava is the book tries to make it so the book objective of the story in the book is to show how if you're obstinate about trying to fulfill goals that cannot be fulfilled, you will fail. But to me, this story really reeks of sexism at its highest point, and just about the extreme disregard that men had for women's lives, women's mental health, women's physical health, women's agencies, and so on. Ultimately, the only good thing that happens, or I wouldn't even say good thing, because ultimately what happens is, after all of this is done, Madhavi is finally sent back to Yayati because her job as a baby making machine is over, and Galava has finished pimping her out, and so he goes on his way because he's happy that he's fulfilled his promise to his guru, so he doesn't give a shit about her. And so now what do you do with this girl who's basically been forced to go to so many people? Yayati tries to arrange a Swayamvara for her, but ultimately Madhavi decides to marry the forest in which the Swayamvara is taking place, and therefore becomes a brahmacharin or an ascetic. And she becomes a very powerful ascetic, and with accruing a lot of energy. And it makes me wonder, like, you know, did her experience, you know, of being forced to sleep with so many men, of being forced to give birth so many times, whether she, without even considering whether she liked it, she wanted it, is this something that she desired for herself, what were her plans, you know, did that finally either give her the courage to say, you know what, I choose myself, my sanity, my freedom, and my empowerment, and I would much rather be happy single than be with somebody else who doesn't care for me, or was this her way of escaping the trauma that she faced with 4 different people, right? Because being with each individual person would have been so different, and how traumatizing it must have been for her. So it's really sad. And after this, we actually come across another Yayati story, which is actually told to us, I think, either in volume 1 or volume 2, where we find out about Yayati, falling down from heaven because of his insolence. He gets so proud that he starts insulting the gods and the sages, and that he's kicked out of heaven. And in that volume, we actually come across 4 kings who save him by giving up their austerities and their energy to him. But here we also find out that that energy and austerities are not enough, and Madhavi, as the brahmacharin, as the ascetic, actually gives up most of her power, most of the austerities that she has accrued for so many years, to help her father, the guy who basically sold her to that sage, and who put her into that position in the first place. So once again, we actually find out how even when a woman tries to do something for herself, she is sort of forced to become this sort of a savior for the man. And even after all of this happens, Madhavi is never credited with being responsible for helping and saving her father. Rather, the 4 kings who are actually her sons, who also contribute a share of their austerities and their power to help Yayati, they are the ones who are actually praised. Because even in the earlier volume, those 4 people, they are the ones who are praised. Whereas Madhavi's contribution, Madhavi's role, her trials, her involvement, her role in helping her father ascend to heaven again is just completely ignored and omitted. Which, once again shows us the erasure of female narratives, erasure of female presence. Because, once again, if you remember volume 2, Draupadi is the one who saves the Pandavas after the first time they lose everything to exile. Right? She's the one who saves them. But everybody forgets about her involvement. Once again, Madhavi saves Yayati. Everybody forgets about Yayati, but Yayati suddenly becomes a hero. So there's a lot in this particular Bhagavat-yana parva that is just it makes my blood boil. But after you finish all of these complicated stories, you come across one particular story which is absolutely beautiful, and which is, again, I say beautiful because it champions a woman in power. But again, it also has its own problems, which I'm going to be discussing. So so Krishna is unable to convince Duryodhana to give the kingdom back to the Pandavas. And again, I have my own thoughts about Krishna's role, because Krishna as a messenger, because he comes as a messenger from the side of the Pandavas, and Krishna's role as a messenger is basically to make sure that he conveys what the Pandavas want. And Yudhishthira does not want a war. He's very clear. I don't want a war. I don't want to fight with the people who raised us. I just want a non-violent ending to this. And Krishna's role as a messenger is to basically just go and give the unadulterated message to the recipient. But then we also have Krishna's role as an avatar of Vishnu, who has descended into the earth in order to facilitate a particular change, a particular event. In this case, the end of the Yuga and the starting of that Kurukshetra war. So it's very interesting to see his dynamic play out as the human Krishna, who is just a messenger, who has to remain sort of not either for war or against war completely, basically not on either side. He has to remain neutral, versus Krishna as Vishnu, whose job is to ensure that the war happens so that what he is born for actually takes place. Because killing comes as just one part of his avatar. Kurukshetra war is another part of his avatar, right? It's what the purpose of his avatar. So it's really interesting to see that kind of human divine Krishna dynamic play out. Okay. So anyways, at the end of this Bhagavat-yana parva, because Krishna is unable to convince Duryodhana to adhere to the terms, and ultimately it's decided that there is nothing except for the war to actually take place, he goes and visits Kunti before leaving. And Kunti tells the story about this woman called Viduraa. In some texts, her name is called Vidula with an L, and Viduraa's son Sanjaya. So please don't confuse this to the Viduraa and Sanjaya who are there in the Kuru dynasty. This is a much more ancient story of a woman who was a chieftain, a woman in power, whose name is Viduraa, and her son Sanjaya. And essentially what happens is Sanjaya loses his kingdom to another king, and Viduraa, Sanjaya and Sanjaya's wife are thrown out of the community, and they're left destitute. And Sanjaya is basically indulging in self-pity, and the conversation is all about how Viduraa tries to rouse him into action and to tell him what is the dharma of a Kshatriya. And the purpose of this story is to basically for Kunti to remind Yudhishthira that he has a misguided sense of dharma, which is once again really interesting to see, because Yudhishthira is always considered to be this sort of dharma raja, the person whose knowledge of dharma is so strong that no one can beat him. He has such good clarity in terms of dharma and so on and so forth. So that's what Yudhishthira is known for, right? But the reality is that Yudhishthira has a very misguided sense of dharma, because ultimately his understanding of dharma should be based on his class and his caste, because that's the reality of the Mahabharata, that his role in the epic is defined by his being a kshatriya, by his being the future king. And so although he's a kshatriya by birth, he tries to exert the dharma of a brahmana. So it's this sort of internal struggle that he has in terms of what is my real path. So he's one of these people, I'm sure you'll have seen people in your own life where we're not sure what we want to do in our lives, and so we're kind of confused. So we kind of give mixed signals. We just kind of float around, let the tides of life sort of take us on on a journey without actually trying to actively do anything, because we're not sure what is our purpose, what we must be doing. So Yudhishthira's sense of dharma is extremely misguided, and so the whole purpose of the conversation between Vidura and Sanjaya is that Vidura tries to arouse Sanjaya into action, and by saying what is the dharma of Kshatriya and what you must do. So what I really liked about this is that we have a woman who is giving her son the right direction. So it's not a man who, as always, the patriarchal narrative of a man leading the way. It's a woman who is helping her child find his footing and do what is right. So I really liked that, the aspect of Vidura coming into tell us what Kshatriya Dharma is actually about. And ultimately, so we do find out that that this particular account, this conversation between Vidura and Sanjaya, is called Jaya. And this makes me wonder if this again was another story that inspired the Mahabharata, right? Because the original name of Mahabharata was Jaya. From Jaya it became Bharata, and then from Bharata it became Mahabharata. So I'm wondering if, apart from the Go-harana parva, if whether this particular story of the conversation between the woman Vidura and her son Sanjaya, the account was called Jaya, was actually a real story, a real conversation of between people who had lost their community, lost their power, lost their kingdom, and that story inspired the epic that we are reading today, the Mahabharata. So that was a really something that I really, that I chewed on for quite a bit. I do want to say that this particular account between Vidura and Sanjaya is extremely transphobic. There are a lot of references to eunuchs and how behaving like a eunuch is bad, and how eunuchs are bad, and so on and so forth. So it's extremely transphobic. So it is distasteful. But again, I want to remind myself and to everybody else that this is a work of its time. So if you're reading this book, please don't take those sentences and that conversation too seriously, because transphobia is not cool and doesn't help anyone. So after this, we go to the Karna Upanivada Parva, where basically, Krishna has failed in his objective as the messenger to prevent the war, and so now he's going to go back to the Pandavas to tell him to get ready for the war. But just before he goes, he calls Karna aside and he tells him about his birth, of the secrets of his birth, and asks him to shift over to the Pandava side. Now, one thing that doesn't make sense is that even in volume 3, where we actually find out Karna's story, only Kunti and Surya are aware of the story of Karna's birth. So how did Krishna find out? Now, the reason that is attributed is that Krishna is divine, so he's a god, so he knows. But we have to remember that in the Mahabharata setting where we are in right now, Krishna functions as a human. So there is a bit of inconsistency in the narrative over there. But again, Krishna fails, and he goes on his way to go back to the Pandavas. And then Kunti comes back and she tries to convince Karna to kind of switch sides and to go back, to go to the Pandavas, where he can become king, where he can become Draupadi's husband. and he can enjoy the kingship. But then Karna, unequivocally refuses and says that no, I've eaten the salt of Dhritarashtra and Duryodhana, and I'm not going to forsake them. And he even calls out Kunti that, you know what, you could have told me this a long time ago, but you're only telling me this now because you want to save your other sons. You don't really care about me. So this is a so again, this particular chapter is just really interesting, because you know what, you see that both Karna and Kunti are both right in their own ways. Karna is right because he was an orphan child, and yes, Kunti could have come and told him the truth of his birth at any given time, but she didn't do it, and she only did it now because she wanted to save her other 5 sons. So Karna feeling upset, and Karna feeling, you know, dejected at Kunti's manipulation, emotional manipulation is valid. But at the same time, we need to ask ourselves, okay, what put Kunti into this impossible situation? Right, we have to remember that she was a child. Okay, she was under 10 years old at the time Durvasa gave her that boon. So she was a child at that age, under 10. If you have kids, I'm sure you can empathize with this. They are not at a level of maturity or mental growth where they can decide important matters of pertaining to children and pertaining to childbirth and things like that. They are not at that mental maturity. So is it Durvasa's fault for putting her into this impossible situation? Is it Surya's fault? Because if you watch my volume 3 review, you'll remember that Surya basically rapes her. So this, we also see divine sort of divine vengeance or something, you could say, wreaked upon Kunti. Then we also see society's fault, you know, society making that world, making that time so toxic and so conservative for women that they had no choice but to choose these impossible solutions. She couldn't accept Karna because then she would have been dubbed a whore, and who knows what would have happened with her. And even now, you know, she's still being blamed, she's still being slut shamed, she's still being called a bad woman, a characterless woman, bad mother, when the reality is that she had no choice. So both of them are right in their own ways. Karna is right in his way, Kunti is right in her way. It's an impossible situation, so we should try not to judge each of them too harshly. All right, so after this is done, you know, because Karna says no, Kunti, but he does promise that I will not kill anybody else except for Arjuna. So he promises her that, so Kunti is happy, and so she goes on her way. Then after this we have the Abhinirvyana Parva, where from this point onwards we actually start the actual move towards war. Abhinirnaya Parva is where both the Kauravas and the Pandavas, they bring their armies together, they set up their armies, and they start moving to Kurukshetra, and they arrive at Kurukshetra. Then we have the Bhishma Abhishechana Parva, where Bhishma is chosen as the general of the Kaurava army, and he is instated and consecrated into that role. On the Pandava side, Drishtadyumna is selected as the general and commander of their army, and the same is done with him. And basically all the other kings come and they put all the Akshahinis come together, and they have finally reached Kurukshetra. Then we have the Ulukayana Parva, where at this point in time the camps have been erected at Kurukshetra. The war is about to begin in just a few hours, and the Duryodhana sends Uluka, a messenger, to the Pandavas, basically taunting them about their lack of strength, their lack of manliness, their lack of perseverance in trying to wrest away the kingdom from him, and he just wants to rile some feathers over there. And the Pandavas and Krishna send another message back through Uluka, saying that, you know what, you just signed your death warrant, so be ready for what happens in the next couple of hours, because we'll hunt you till the ends of the earth. And then finally we end the volume 4 with the Ratha Atiratha Samkhya Parva, where the conversation is between Bhishma and Duryodhana, where Bhishma basically tells Duryodhana about the important and powerful kings both in the Kaurava side and the Pandava side. And he promises Duryodhana that I will kill tens of thousands of soldiers and generals every day for you and weaken the Pandava army, but I will not touch a hair on the head of the 5 Pandava brothers. So because they are my grandsons as well, so I cannot harm them. So I will not hurt any of those 5, but I will weaken the army by systematically killing tens of thousands of soldiers every single day. And then he says that, and then he talks about Shikandi and how he, although he respects Shikandi as a very powerful warrior, because he was a woman in his previous life, he will not hurt Shikandi as well. And if Shikandi is capable of killing him, Shikandi should try. And with that, we come to the end of volume 4. We are just a few short hours, maybe 2-3 hours away from the war. It's very early in the morning, and both the Pandava and Kaurava armies have already formed their battle formations, the vyuhas. They've already formed their vyuhas and they're standing. Drishtadyumna is already on the field leading the charge. Bhishma is donning his armor and getting ready to go into war. And the final consultations are being done. And in just a few short hours, the war will officially begin. So, volume 4 complete, and we are going into the 18-day massacre at Kurukshetra. Now, volume 5. This is volume 5. And this book, I want to offer a correction from my previous review. I mentioned when I was talking at the end of the last review about what is there in volume 4, I accidentally talked about the story in volume 5. So volume 5 actually covers Bhishma Parva, where we see how Bhishma fights and Bhishma's death. Then we start Drona Parva, and we are introduced to Abhimanyu engaging in battle with the Kauravas and entering the vyuha, which actually ends up being his fatal mistake. So if I believe, I think the first 8 days or the first 10 days are when Bhishma is the commander. I might be wrong, so please forgive me for that. I will let you know once I finish this book. But this is the first initial few days of the war until Bhishma dies, and this first starting part of Drona Parva. So book 5 and book 6 and book 7, all 3 books, which come up to roughly 1600 pages, are all about the war. The 18-day war is in the next 3 volumes of this book. And yeah, I'll give a couple of days break and I'll start with volume 5. My goal this year is to finish 2024 with ending the volumes 5, 6 and 7, because I don't want to take a break between reading the war narrative, because I believe that, because this is going to be there is going to be some repetitive element in terms of the fights that take place, because this did happen in the Ramayana volume 3, the fight between the Rama's army and Ravana's army, where a lot of things were kind of repetitive, and that was just in one book, mind you, right? So it did get a little tiring and fatiguing at a point in time. But with this book, with Mahabharata, this is the crux. 3 whole books, 1600 pages almost, is entirely of the war. So I don't want to give too much gap between them, because I don't want to stall the reading, because after these 3 volumes we have 3 more in the Mahabharata and the Harivamsha, so 4 books altogether of another at least 2000 pages or so to complete the entire Mahabharata series. So I have my work cut out for me. So I believe that if I can finish volumes 5, 6 and 7 by the end of 2024, then mid 2026 I can finish the entire Mahabharata series. So alright, fingers crossed, wish me luck. Alright, this video has been super long. If you stuck around with me so far, thank you so much for watching. And yes, let's get ready. I'm in anticipation of what is to come, and I'm eager to see what's gonna happen. Alright, I will keep sharing my progress with you. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time on Tales in Text. Bye bye.